You wear a mask every day, not the physical kind, but the one you crafted over years, the polished version of yourself that smiles when you're crumbling inside, that agrees to keep the peace, that hides the parts of you deemed too angry, too sensitive, too dark. And yet, somewhere beneath that mask, something stirs. A whisper, a weight, a feeling that you're not fully living, only performing. You tell yourself you've moved on from the past, that you're fine, that you've grown. But have you ever wondered who you might become if you stopped running? There's a part of you you've tried to forget. The part that felt rejected, ashamed, abandoned. The part that lashed out or collapsed inward. You buried it. You called it weakness, madness, sin. But Carl Jung didn't see it that way. He believed that the very aspects of ourselves we try hardest to escape, the fears, the wounds, the buried desires, hold the key to our deepest transformation, not in spite of the darkness, but through it. This isn't self-help, it's self-confrontation, and it's not a journey for the faint of heart. Because to face the shadow is to face the raw truth of who you are when no one's watching. It's to ask the questions you've spent years avoiding. Why do I keep repeating the same patterns? Why do I sabotage what I want? Why do I feel like something is missing, even when I have everything? What if the parts you're ashamed of aren't flaws to be fixed, but fragments to be reclaimed? What if the version of you you've been avoiding is the most honest one of all? And what if healing isn't about becoming someone new, but remembering the wholeness you've always carried inside? Have you ever said something in the heat of the moment and later wondered, where did that come from? Or perhaps you've felt a strong dislike for someone, even though you couldn't explain why. These moments offer a glimpse into what Carl Jung called the shadow self, the hidden, unconscious part of our psyche that holds the thoughts, emotions, and impulses we don't want to admit we have. According to Jungian psychology, the shadow isn't just some dark corner of our mind. It's an essential part of who we are. And yet, most people spend their lives unaware of it, or worse, running from it. The shadow self is everything within us that we have rejected, denied, or disowned. It's formed early in life as we begin to adapt to social norms, expectations, and ideals. As children, we learn what behaviors are rewarded and what are punished. We start editing ourselves, suppressing qualities that don't fit into the image we're trying to project. Whether that image is obedient child, perfect student, good friend, or productive adult. But these rejected traits don't vanish. Instead, they're buried deep in the unconscious, forming the shadow. Jung believed that every human psyche contains this shadow, and that it is neither inherently good nor evil. It simply is. It's raw, primal, and often uncomfortable to confront. It may contain anger, jealousy, selfishness, lust, laziness, or greed, but it also holds creativity, intuition, power, and authenticity that have been locked away for fear of judgment. It is, in Jung's words, the thing a person has no wish to be. But paradoxically, the more we deny the shadow, the more control it has over us. The less we own our darker impulses, the more likely they are to erupt when we least expect it. This is why shadow work, the practice of becoming aware of and integrating your shadow, is not just psychological hygiene, it's a spiritual necessity. The shadow isn't a flaw to be fixed, but a part of ourselves that needs understanding. When we push the shadow into the unconscious, we don't eliminate it, we project it onto others. This is why you may find yourself irritated by someone who is arrogant or attention-seeking, when in reality, those are traits you've repressed in yourself. You see them in others because you refuse to see them in the mirror. Jung observed that the path to individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, requires the integration of the shadow. He compared this process to the mythological hero's journey, a descent into the underworld, a confrontation with inner demons, and the return to the surface with newfound wisdom. Only by facing what we fear within ourselves can we unlock our full potential. Ignoring the shadow means living a divided life, always at war with ourselves. It's important to note that integrating the shadow does not mean acting on every dark impulse. It means acknowledging its existence, understanding its origin, and finding healthy ways to express its energy. For example, someone who represses their anger may suffer from chronic anxiety or passive-aggressive behavior, but by confronting and owning their anger, they can learn to set boundaries and assert themselves constructively. In this way, the shadow becomes an ally, not a saboteur. Jung emphasized that self-awareness is not achieved by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is not an easy task. It requires radical honesty, deep introspection, and a willingness to feel uncomfortable. But the reward is immense. As we integrate our shadow, we become more whole. We stop projecting our darkness onto others. We reclaim parts of ourselves we had abandoned. We become grounded, authentic, and resilient. In the end, the shadow is not the enemy. It is a guide, one that leads us through the dark forests of our inner world toward a deeper understanding of who we truly are. Most people avoid the shadow because they fear what they'll find. But Jung reminds us that the gold is in the dark. What we reject in ourselves may be the very key to our growth, transformation, and freedom. So ask yourself, what are you hiding from? What part of you have you locked away? Because the journey of knowing yourself doesn't begin with light. It begins in the shadows. And once you step into them, not to fight, but to listen, you'll discover a self that's been waiting patiently to be seen. Most people go through life convinced they are in full control of their actions, emotions, and choices. They believe they are rational, consistent, and morally upright. But beneath that carefully curated surface often lies a storm of repressed feelings, urges, and unresolved pain, hidden in the shadow. And while we may think we've buried these aspects deep enough to forget, the truth is, the shadow never stays silent. It speaks in disguise. It acts out indirectly. And if we're not aware, we start living as its puppet without even realizing it. Avoiding the shadow doesn't mean it disappears. In fact, the more we suppress it, the louder it becomes, but in ways that are distorted, toxic, or destructive. One of the most common signs of avoiding the shadow is chronic projection. Jung defined projection as the unconscious transfer of our own undesirable traits onto others. For instance, the person who constantly accuses others of being selfish may, in reality, be denying their own selfish impulses. The more we fail to acknowledge something within ourselves, the more we see it everywhere else. Another sign is emotional overreactions. When we respond to situations with intense anger, disgust, or judgment that feels disproportionate, it's often because the situation has triggered a part of ourselves we're not willing to face. Jung taught that our triggers are like flashing lights pointing to the shadow. That person who annoys you to an irrational degree, that behavior you can't stand in others, those are often reflections of something disowned within. The more you react, the more likely it is the shadow is involved. Patterns of self-sabotage are another clue. You set goals but never quite reach them. You get close to happiness, then pull away. You attract the same toxic relationships over and over. It feels like something inside you is working against your own success. That something is often the shadow in disguise, expressing deep unconscious beliefs like, I'm not worthy, I don't deserve love, or success is dangerous. These beliefs aren't random. They were born from moments of rejection, trauma, or shame, and they live in the parts of you you've buried. Perfectionism is a subtle but powerful form of shadow avoidance. When we strive to be perfect, we create a rigid identity that leaves no room for flaws, mistakes, or vulnerability. But perfection is a mask, and it requires the constant suppression of our humanness. The shadow, with all its messiness, doesn't fit into a perfect image, so we push it away, and the cost is authenticity. Perfectionists often suffer from inner emptiness because they've sacrificed their true selves for an ideal that can never be fulfilled. Then there's moral superiority. People who constantly place themselves on a moral pedestal often do so to escape their own inner contradictions. When you refuse to believe that you are capable of darkness, you create a split in the psyche, a false self that is all good, and a shadow that becomes darker by contrast. Jung warned that the brighter the persona, the darker the shadow. Those who see themselves as saints often carry demons they're unwilling to face. Real moral strength comes not from denial, but from integration. Depression, anxiety, and inner numbness can also signal shadow suppression. These conditions aren't always rooted in the shadow, but they often involve it. When we deny major parts of our psyche, we lose energy. We feel disjointed. Life becomes flat or overwhelming because we are not living as a whole person. In Jungian therapy, many patients who began confronting their shadow found that their symptoms eased, not because the pain disappeared, but because they were no longer running from themselves. Perhaps the most subtle and haunting sign of shadow avoidance is the feeling of inauthenticity. That quiet sense that you're not truly living as yourself, that you're performing roles, saying what's expected, doing what's acceptable, but it doesn't feel real. This disconnection from the self often stems from rejecting the very parts that make us whole. Your anger, your ambition, your sensuality, your vulnerability, these are not enemies. They are parts of the full spectrum of your humanity, and when denied, they create a false version of you, hollow and restrained. So what can we do? The first step is to stop running. The shadow doesn't go away because we ignore it. It waits, it watches, and it finds a way to express itself through our relationships, choices, and emotional life, often with painful consequences. But when we turn and face it, when we become curious rather than afraid, the shadow begins to reveal not just our wounds, but also our power. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to be honest. Notice the patterns, question the triggers, pay attention to what you avoid in others and what you hide in yourself. The shadow is not a threat, it is a portal. When we deny our shadow, we don't escape it, we bury it alive. And in doing so, we unknowingly create a life shaped not by conscious choice, but by unconscious reaction. Carl Jung warned us that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This isn't just poetic wisdom, it's a psychological truth with real painful consequences. The more we suppress what's inside, the more we lose control over how it shows up. The shadow doesn't vanish through avoidance, it festers. Suppression is not silence, it's pressure building up behind a dam. What you push down gains energy in the unconscious and finds expression through behaviors, emotions, and events you can't explain. You think you've conquered your anger because you never raise your voice, yet you sabotage relationships with passive aggression. You think you're over your childhood wounds, yet you attract the same emotional patterns in every partner. This is the shadow operating behind the scenes, whispering decisions into your mind while you believe they're your own. Over time, this disconnection creates an inner fracture. You begin to feel like a stranger to yourself. You make choices that feel misaligned. You live according to expectations instead of instincts. You wear masks so long that you forget what your real face looks like. Jung understood this as the cost of living only through the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the world. But when we become overly identified with this mask and exile our shadow, we trade authenticity for acceptance, and deep down, we know something's missing. Psychologically, this creates tension that often manifests as anxiety, not just surface-level worry, but a deep, persistent unease, like something important is being ignored, and something is. Anxiety becomes a signal from the unconscious, alerting us that a vital part of the self is being denied. Depression, too, can stem from prolonged shadow suppression. When you exile parts of yourself for too long, you begin to feel hollow, fatigued, and emotionally numb. Life becomes mechanical, joyless, because when the shadow is locked away, so is your vitality. Worse still, the shadow tends to emerge in moments of emotional crisis. We can suppress for a while, but the energy of the shadow builds over time, and one day something cracks. A breakup, a job loss, a betrayal, and suddenly we're overwhelmed by emotions we don't understand. Rage, bitterness, envy, despair. We may lash out, collapse, or spiral. These aren't random meltdowns. They are the shadow erupting after years of being ignored. And the more unaware we are of it, the more dangerous and chaotic its release can be. Jung believed that neurosis often arises from a clash between the conscious attitude and the unconscious mind. The more rigidly we cling to our self-image, the more violently the shadow rebels. A person who sees themselves as always nice may suppress healthy anger, only to develop resentment and burnout. A person who prides themselves on rationality may deny their emotional needs, only to suffer from chronic anxiety. These contradictions create inner conflict, and that conflict, when unresolved, bleeds into our external life. Relationships are often where this damage becomes most visible. The shadow seeks expression, and if it cannot emerge within us, it finds release through others. We attract partners, friends, or enemies who embody the very traits we've disowned. We create drama not because we love chaos, but because the unconscious wants integration. Jung called this shadow projection, and it's one of the most common traps we fall into when we avoid the work of inner reconciliation. Until we recognize that the enemy lives within, we keep finding them outside. Even our creative and professional lives suffer. The shadow contains not only negative traits, but also suppressed gifts, creativity, passion, ambition, intuition. When we suppress the shadow, we also dim our potential. We may fear standing out, fear failure, or fear our own power, because those fears are rooted in shadow beliefs formed in early life. Maybe you were told not to be too much. Maybe you learned that success makes others jealous. These wounds take root in the unconscious and quietly limit what we believe is possible. But perhaps the deepest cost of shadow denial is spiritual disconnection. When we live only from the surface, we cut ourselves off from the depth of our own psyche. We lose touch with meaning, with soul, with mystery. Jung believed the shadow was not just a psychological construct, but a gateway to transformation. It's the part of us that carries the energy of change, the raw material for alchemy, and when we reject it, we forfeit the chance to evolve. To suppress the shadow is to deny a part of your humanity. To live in denial is to carry the burden of unresolved pain, unmet needs, and untapped power. Every day we navigate a world we believe is objective, reacting to people and situations as though they're separate from us. But Carl Jung showed us that much of what we experience is not merely external, it's filtered through the lens of our own unconscious. Our reality is not just what happens to us, it's what we perceive, and what we perceive is shaped by what we've hidden inside. This is the mirror effect of the shadow self, where the outer world becomes a reflection of the inner world we've refused to face. At the core of this concept is projection. Jung explained that we see in others the parts of ourselves we do not accept. If we're unaware of our own aggressiveness, we may see others as hostile. If we've denied our competitiveness, we may label others as power-hungry or arrogant. If we've repressed our sexuality, We may be overly critical of others' expressions of sensuality. What we attack, mock, or reject in others is often what we cannot accept in ourselves. The world becomes our unconscious on display. This mechanism is not malicious or irrational. It's psychological survival. The mind protects the ego, our conscious self-image, by offloading the parts that threaten it. Instead of admitting, "I'm jealous," it's easier to say, "They're manipulative." Instead of facing our fears of inadequacy, we dismiss others as show-offs. But while projection offers temporary relief, it keeps us stuck in cycles of blame and misunderstanding. We think we're reacting to others, but we're really reacting to ourselves, our shadow cloaked in the behavior of those around us. Relationships become the stage where this drama plays out most intensely. Friends, lovers, co-workers, they all serve as mirrors. We attract people who embody our unconscious material, both light and dark. If you've disowned your independence, you may find yourself dependent on dominant partners. If you've buried your need for tenderness, you may crave emotionally distant people, hoping they'll finally give you what you refuse to give yourself. This is not fate or misfortune. It is the unconscious seeking wholeness through external relationships. Even conflict is a form of self-discovery. When someone triggers us deeply, that reaction is not always about them. It's an invitation to explore what within us has not been healed. Jung encouraged us to pause and ask, "What is this person showing me about myself?" This isn't about blaming ourselves or excusing bad behavior. It's about recognizing that our emotional responses are windows into the parts of us that remain unconscious. The intensity of your reaction is the intensity of your reflection. The shadow also colors our opportunities and limitations. If you unconsciously believe you're unworthy of success, you may miss or sabotage chances to grow. If you carry internalized shame, you may interpret others' neutral actions as rejection. Your shadow becomes the scriptwriter behind the scenes, shaping how you interpret events, how you react, and what you allow yourself to experience. Until the shadow is made conscious, it continues to run the show, and you think it's just bad luck, or that the world is against you. Jung's work reveals that the more you reject your shadow, the more your life becomes shaped by it. That's the paradox. The attempt to escape your inner darkness doesn't make you free. It entangles you in projection, fear, and confusion. On the other hand, the more you become aware of your unconscious tendencies, the more clearly you see others, and the more honest your relationships become. Reality becomes less distorted, more grounded, and far more empowering. Facing the shadow isn't just an internal process. It reshapes your external world. When you integrate your anger, you stop attracting constant conflict. When you own your ambition, you stop envying those who succeed. When you embrace your vulnerability, you stop fearing intimacy. Your outer world transforms because your inner world has healed. The projections fall away, and in their place, you begin to see people as they are, not as distorted mirrors of your wounds, but as fellow travelers on their own journeys. Jung often used the phrase, healing the split. This refers to the fracture in the psyche that occurs when we reject parts of ourselves. When we stop running from the shadow, we begin to unify the self, and that unity brings clarity. The world stops being a battlefield of enemies and obstacles and becomes a place of reflection, growth, and connection. So if your world feels hostile, unfair, or confusing, don't just look outward. Look inward. What in your reality feels familiar, repetitive, or emotionally charged? What are you always running into no matter where you go? These are the fingerprints of your shadow, asking to be seen, understood, and integrated. The mirror is not there to punish you, it's there to wake you up. In the end, your shadow shapes your reality, not to trap you, but to lead you. There comes a point on the journey of self-discovery when you stop running. not because you've escaped the darkness, but because you finally turned around to face it. This moment is not comfortable, it's not easy, but it is necessary. Carl Jung described this process as integrating the shadow, consciously acknowledging, accepting, and incorporating the rejected parts of ourselves into the whole. And though it may feel like meeting a monster, it's often where we discover our greatest strength. The shadow is not evil. It contains our rage, envy, lust, and shame, but also our passion, creativity, intuition, and unexpressed power. It is morally neutral. What makes it dangerous is unconsciousness. Left in the dark, shadow traits act out in distorted ways, often harming ourselves or others. But once brought into awareness, these same energies can be transformed into fuel for growth, clarity, and depth. Jung believed that integration was not about becoming good, but becoming whole. The first step in this process is radical honesty. You must be willing to see yourself not as you wish to be, but as you are. This doesn't mean indulging in your worst impulses or justifying harmful behavior. It means recognizing those impulses exist, that you, like all humans, contain contradiction. You can be kind and cruel, generous and selfish, brave and afraid. Integration begins when we stop identifying only with our persona, the mask we show the world, and accept that there's more beneath the surface. One of the most effective tools Jung used was shadow work through self-inquiry. Ask yourself, what traits in others do I hate or criticize most? When do I feel most reactive or triggered? Where in my life do I sabotage myself? These questions shine a light on the unconscious. They help reveal the stories, beliefs, and wounds that have been exiled into the shadow. The answers might be uncomfortable, but they are the starting point of transformation. Another powerful technique is journaling or dialoguing with the shadow. This involves writing from the perspective of your shadow self, letting it speak uncensored. What does it want? What does it fear? What has it been trying to protect you from? This process might feel strange at first, but it brings clarity. It reveals not only the pain that created the shadow, but the intention behind it. Often you'll find that the shadow formed as a defense. It took on certain traits to help you survive emotionally, even if those traits are no longer serving you now. Jung also emphasized the importance of dreams in shadow integration. The unconscious speaks in symbols, and dreams are a direct channel to that language. Pay attention to recurring figures in your dreams, especially those you fear, argue with, or reject. These are often shadow archetypes trying to communicate aspects of yourself that are being ignored. Working with dream material can be a profound method of bringing shadow contents into consciousness, especially with the help of a Jungian analyst or inner work practice. What's crucial in this journey is compassion. Many people fear the shadow because they believe it proves they're bad or broken. But the shadow is not your enemy. It's the part of you that was never loved. It developed in the dark because you believed it had no place in the light. To integrate it, you must meet it not with judgment, but with curiosity and care. You must become the parent, the protector, the witness to your own inner exiles. As you bring the shadow into the light, something remarkable happens. You begin to reclaim your power. That anger you repressed, it becomes assertiveness. That envy, it becomes clarity about what you truly desire. That fear, it reveals where you long for safety or support. The energies of the shadow, when integrated, lose their chaotic edge and become usable strength. They make you more grounded, more authentic, and more whole. Integration also changes how you relate to others. When you no longer fear your own shadow, you stop projecting it onto the world. You become less reactive, more understanding. You see people not just for their personas, but for their complexity. You can hold space for imperfection because you've learned to do it within yourself. Jung called this the path toward individuation, the process of becoming the full version of who you are, beyond the masks and roles. It's important to remember that shadow work is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing practice, a lifelong relationship with the unconscious. There will always be new layers to uncover, new patterns to examine, new parts of yourself asking to be seen. But with each step toward integration, the inner war begins to quiet. The need to control, to please, to pretend fades. In its place comes a deeper presence, a steadier truth. Meeting your shadow is not about conquering it. It's about listening. It's about seeing yourself fully and saying, even this part belongs. Carl Jung saw shadow work not merely as a psychological task, but as a spiritual and alchemical process. In ancient alchemy, the goal was to turn lead into gold, an outward metaphor for inner transformation. Jung believed the human psyche follows a similar path. We begin with the base material of our unconscious, our fears, traumas, repressed desires, and through the fire of self-awareness and integration, we transform it into wisdom, strength, and authentic identity. This is not self-improvement. This is self-transmutation. When you begin to consciously integrate the shadow, something shifts. You stop reacting to your emotions and start learning from them. You stop being a victim of your inner chaos and start becoming its interpreter. Emotions that once controlled you, anger, jealousy, fear, become messages rather than enemies. And in decoding them, you recover fragments of your buried self. Jung understood that each negative emotion is a signal, a map pointing towards something unhealed or undeveloped. Take anger, for example. Left in the shadow, it erupts in outbursts or implodes as depression. But when integrated, anger becomes the energy of boundaries. It tells you where you've been crossed, where you're compromising yourself. It's a spark of your personal power. Jealousy, when unexamined, corrodes relationships. But if you listen, it often reveals your unclaimed desires, parts of your potential that you've denied or feared to pursue. Even shame, one of the most painful shadow emotions, can show you where a younger version of yourself was hurt, judged, or silenced. When seen with compassion, it becomes a gateway to inner healing. This is the alchemy, seeing the gold hidden in the darkness, not romanticizing the pain, but realizing that every suppressed part of you has a purpose. The shadow is not a mistake in your psyche. It's the part that holds your unlived life. And when you reclaim it, you unlock new layers of creativity, intuition, and clarity. You begin to feel more alive because you are no longer splintered between who you are and who you pretend to be. Jung emphasized that integration of the shadow leads to individuation, a term he used to describe the journey toward wholeness. This is not about becoming perfect or morally superior. It's about becoming real. A person who has faced their darkness is not easily shaken. They've confronted the chaos within and can hold it without fear. They know their triggers and don't need to act them out. They accept their contradictions, and because of that, they move through the world with authenticity and depth. What's powerful is that this transformation radiates outward. As you become more whole internally, your relationships shift. You stop unconsciously demanding others to complete you, validate you, or carry your unloved parts. You can meet others as they are, without projection, without illusion. You communicate more honestly because you're no longer trying to hide your own emotional truth. You listen more deeply because you've learned to listen to yourself. In the alchemical tradition, fire was the agent of transformation. In the psyche, that fire is awareness. And like fire, awareness illuminates, but it also burns. It shows us what we've hidden, and it forces us to change. The process of shadow integration is rarely comfortable. It often involves grieving the masks we wore, the years we spent hiding, the parts of ourselves we rejected. But this grief is sacred. It clears the space for something more honest to emerge. And what emerges is not weakness, it's resilience. When you've embraced your shadow, you're no longer afraid of your own mind. You're not driven by impulse or shame. You're not pretending to be smaller than you are to fit into other people's expectations. You're no longer avoiding your truth. You're embodying it. That's real strength, not control, not perfection, but presence. Jung often described the fully integrated person as a being with depth and gravitas, someone who has looked into their own abyss and come back with vision. These people are rare, but they are unmistakable. They carry a calm authority, an emotional richness, and a creative fire. They aren't ruled by fear because they've met their fear. They don't need to dominate because they've reclaimed their power. They aren't reactive because they've understood their patterns. They are, in the truest sense, free. And that freedom is not just for the self. It becomes a gift to the world. When you do the work of integrating your shadow, you don't just change your life. You shift the energy you bring to others. You become less part of the collective problem and more part of the healing. You no longer project your inner war onto society, relationships, or culture. You lead by example. Quietly, steadily, you show what it means to live as a whole human being. At the end of the shadow journey lies not a final destination, but a profound realization. The parts of yourself you've spent your life avoiding were never your enemies. They were your greatest teachers, waiting in the dark for you to turn and look. Carl Jung's philosophy wasn't about eliminating the shadow. It was about embracing it as an essential part of the path to wholeness. This is the moment where your fragmented self begins to come together, not through force or control, but through compassion and radical acceptance. By now, you've seen that the shadow is not a simple concept. It's a living, breathing force within the psyche. It is where all the unlived aspects of your being reside. But what makes the shadow so powerful is also what makes it sacred. It holds the key to your full humanity. Jung believed that to become whole, you must bring your light into contact with your darkness. That's where transformation happens, not in denial, but in the courageous act of integration. When you accept the shadow, you begin to live with a new kind of clarity. Life stops being a series of reactions and becomes a conscious engagement. You no longer fear discomfort because you understand its origin. You no longer reject your emotional storms because you've learned to navigate them. You are no longer defined by roles, masks, or conditioning. You are defined by your willingness to be real. That authenticity is the heartbeat of wholeness. There is a quiet power in a person who has done their shadow work. They carry themselves differently, not with superiority, but with sincerity. They don't need to prove themselves because they've already met themselves. They have sat with their pain, their darkness, their shame, and instead of running, they've stayed. That staying power, that presence, creates a kind of groundedness that others can feel. It makes them trustworthy, not because they are flawless, but because they are honest. This honesty changes how you live, love, and lead. In relationships, you stop demanding perfection or rescuing others. You no longer fall into endless loops of projection because you recognize the difference between your inner world and external reality. You can love more deeply because you've accepted the parts of yourself you once thought were unlovable. That inner reconciliation allows for genuine connection with others. Professionally, you begin to bring your full self into your work, not just the polished version. You allow your instincts, your creativity, your unique perspective to shine. You no longer censor your truth to fit a mold, because you've made peace with your complexity. You understand that true contribution comes not from perfection, but from presence. And when you lead from a place of wholeness, others feel safe to do the same. This journey also deepens your spirituality, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in how you relate to meaning, to purpose, to life itself. You begin to see every challenge, every person, every emotion as part of the unfolding process of becoming. Nothing is wasted. Even your worst mistakes or most painful experiences become sources of insight and integration. Jung saw this as individuation, a lifelong unfolding of the self, where every piece of your psyche finds its rightful place in the whole. What's perhaps most liberating is this. You realize you are not just the shadow, and you are not just the light. You are the container that holds both. You are the witness who can hold paradox without collapsing. You can grieve and be grateful. You can feel rage and still act with love. You can be afraid and move forward anyway. This is true inner freedom, the ability to hold your full humanity without fragmentation. And yet, the work never ends. The shadow shifts, evolves, and re-emerges in new forms throughout life. Each stage of growth reveals new blind spots, new layers of unconscious material. But now you no longer fear that. You understand that this is the rhythm of becoming, descent and return, darkness and light, death and rebirth. The path is not linear but cyclical, and every time you circle back to your shadow, you do so with more wisdom, more self-awareness, and more peace. In this way, the shadow becomes your guide, your mirror, your ally. It no longer sabotages you from behind the scenes. It walks beside you, whispering truths you were once afraid to hear. And those truths become your compass, pointing you not away from yourself, but toward your most authentic self. So ask yourself, in this moment, what part of you still waits in the dark? What piece of your story still aches to be acknowledged? That is your invitation. That is your teacher. And when you finally sit with it, not as a threat, but as a message, you'll discover what Jung discovered, that the journey into the shadow is not the end of who you are. It is the beginning of who you were always meant to be.